On today's episode, Dr. Liz and I have a great discussion with Dr. Brad Wilcox. He shares key insights from his research and recent book about why marriage matters more now than ever. From careers and cohabitation to commitment and communication, Dr. Wilcox unloads on the importance of intentionally creating stronger marriages, which are fundamental to children's safety and stability. Dr. Brad Wilcox is a professor of sociology and director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia, Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He is the author of several books, including his most recent book, Get Married: Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. Dr. Wilcox studies marriage, fatherhood, and the impact of strong and stable families on men, women, and children. We hope you enjoy the show. Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the Stronger Marriage Connection podcast. I'm Dr. Dave here at Utah State University alongside Dr. Liz Hale, our psychologist and therapist. Our aim, our hope is really to bring you the best we have in valid research, along with resources and tips and tools to help you create the marriage of your dreams. Okay, well, boy, we know in recent decades that marriage rates have fallen. There's all kinds of obstacles and challenges in front of couples today. It's becoming harder and harder, really, to stay closer together in a world that is really pulling us apart. We're here to discuss why marriage matters more than ever is one of the greatest marriage champions I consider in the world, Dr. Brad Wilcox. Welcome to the show.
Dave, it's great to be here with both you and Liz.
We're so happy.
Yes, I have to mention right off the front, Brad, that you're in Virginia, but man, you have done so much great work. I know that you're a big fan of a lot of the stuff that's happening in Utah. So thank you so much for championing marriage and for the great efforts that you have partnered with so many here in Utah.
Well, thanks, Dave. I've written even recently, actually, in the last, I think, 2 months about the ways in which Utah is number one when it comes to the share of kids who are being raised in married, stable families. So, hats off to you guys there in the Beehive State, and hoping that you can share your wisdom with us and we can do the same, with you as well.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think there's a lot of great things that are happening in Utah. We have our share of struggles as well. Let's start broadly, really, Brad, if you don't mind, talking about marital quality. You studied marital stability for quite some time. What are, I guess, some of the big picture important findings for people to be aware of, even predictors of happy, healthy marriages? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, Dave, what I've seen in my own research is thinking about this in terms of really kind of like, 5 C's for strong and stable marriages. And so what I see is communion being important, understanding the role and importance of children for couples who have kids and sort of how that fits into their marriage, the value of commitment. Cash is number 4, and then community is number 5. And so what I see is the couples who are kind of able to kind of understand and appreciate how each of those 5 C's is playing out in their marriage are more likely to be flourishing. And to start with kind of the most important factor in the work that I've done with, in part, Jeff Dew, who's there at BYU, but also my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, who's based with these family studies, is what we kind of tend to see in our research is that the number one factor for marital quality, and really probably stability as well, is just commitment. And that can be obviously measured in different kinds of ways, but sort of, I think about this both in kind of an institutional way and then a personal relationship way. So institutionally speaking, I would kind of underline the importance of sort of seeing marriage as a permanent commitment. And that, practically that means you're not going to put the D word, the divorce word, into your arguments, your conflicts, your communications with your spouse. You have the sense that, you've made a commitment to someone and, you're in for the long haul. That's one expression of a more institutionalized model of commitment. But then personally too, you're committed to the welfare of your spouse and your marriage. And so that means trying to figure out ways to, make sure your spouse is flourishing, make sure that, your marriage is kind of the most important thing. You're not going to do anything to harm that. And so, of course, one practical expression of that, of course, would be, for instance, steering clear of both like in-person infidelity and now virtual infidelities as well. And kind of being practical about not putting yourself in a situation where you're going to be, endangering that marital bond as well. So that's the commitment piece. We could touch on that. In terms of other things that I see in the research that I've been doing lately, we've got a piece coming out soon with Dr. Jeff Dew and Dr. Jason Carroll. Besides commitment, we touch on the value of church going as an expression of community. That's a big predictor of marital quality for Americans, both women and men. We see too on what I call the communion side, sort of forging that intimacy in marriage, that date nights are also helpful, particularly for women, what we see in our research there. And so kind of being intentional about having some kind of regular fun thing you do as a couple where the kids are kind of, given to grandparents or a babysitter or maybe a friend, and you're doing something that's, special and set apart for you as a couple. And then the final thing that came out in our research that I think was a bit unusual, Dave and Liz, is protection. And we find for both men, but especially women, that rating your spouse as protective was highly predictive of greater marital quality. Now, I've got a sense, ironically, of how this, I think, plays out for women because I talk to a lot of women in my book prep for this. But, doing things like, strangely, I would say almost like walking along the street side of the sidewalk was mentioned by a number of women that I spoke to. They appreciated when their boyfriends or their husbands would do that when they were out like in a city context. They felt safer in that way. Or, a husband who kind of, would fill up the gas tank, making sure that, they can jump in the car and not worry about that. Having the husband kind of just go around, checking the house at night to make sure it's secure. And then, of course, more saliently, kind of standing up for them physically. One couple I spoke to, the wife said that when they were dating in the city, they were in a subway and it was late at night and the subway car was emptying. And finally, it was just them as a couple and one kind of more sketchy character. And as they were going from one stop to the next, he kind of approached them in a menacing way and demanded their money. And her then boyfriend, her now husband, stood up, put his hand out, yelled at the guy, and put himself between the guy and this woman. And she said for that was kind of like it all kind of came together for her in that moment. This was the guy. And fortunately, they came into the next stop and it was crowded and they were able just to get out. But she just had the sense that he was, willing to kind of put his body on the line for her. And that was, valued. So I think there's something about kind of seeing your spouse as protective in that sense, but also probably too, just like for both husbands and wives, like, they're maybe protecting you from, people in your life who might wish you harm in some way, socially or professionally, maybe we could think about, I'm not sure like how men would think about their wife as protective, but just interesting finding that, again, we find this is one of the strongest factors in today's marriages that, sort of viewing your spouse as protective is also a big deal.
Wow. That's interesting. Liz, I'd love your take on that. What's your thoughts on that?
So true. And, I think even Dr. Gottman in the book he wrote, Men's Guide to Women, he talks about safety. He talks about a professor who's asked a group of men and women, how many of you women have feared for your life today? Nearly every hand goes up, just had fear, like just even walking from the car to the building in the parking lot. And how many of you have had fear recently, today, last week? It was just numbers where just hands didn't go up. We just feel fear. And so when men know that, it's a bit of a secret power, I think.
But Liz, let me ask you this question. I mean, why do you think so? We do find the association is stronger for women when it comes to their rating of their spouse's protectiveness and the quality of their marriage and perceived stability. But we also found too that men who are rating their wives as more protective were also happy in their marriages. And I'm not sure, like, do you have any, and Dave too, like, what do you, for men, how would we think of our wives as, like, in what kinds of ways would we think of them as being protective of us, would you say?
I think respect is a really big thing for men. It's like oxygen to a man. So I know that when I'm respecting my husband, what he thinks, and I'm not telling him what to what to wear, how to drive, what to do, what to say, how to type that email. When I give him respect, I think that feels very protective of our relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It doesn't feel as much like physical protection, but maybe just emotionally, or just her thoughtfulness that she's putting, me first in her mind, that hey, she bakes some bread or whatever. And she comes in, she's done that several times and just says, hey, I'm thinking about you. And that's what it feels like, is this, that you're on my mind.
Yeah. Okay.
That's interesting.
So a kind of salience of, you have the sense that they're kind of
for us, right?
Yeah, for us. That's a good way to talk about it. Yeah. So
I love Dr. Brad, how Dave calls you one of the great marriage champions in the world. That's so true. And that's what we call Dr. Dave Schramm around here too. So I would say that you both are that. Oh, I love that. And it's just an interview I've always looked forward to. You've been saying lately that marriage matters today more than ever before. Why this urgency, Brad?
So, Liz and Dave, I think, and to be clear, this is kind of more of a hypothesis that I have than a conclusion, right? I think that we're living in a context, right, where there's more economic inequality, where people are technologically distracted. And we just saw a piece in the Atlantic last week talking about the rise of the antisocial century. People are just not in touch, in person as much. People feel lonelier today. I think there are fewer common norms governing and guiding our lives. So I think it's in this context, Liz, that marriage and family don't just matter for kids and adults, but they probably matter more than ever in some domains. Now, for adults, to be clear, the only real compelling evidence I have on that score right now, I'm looking at a bunch of outcomes with some colleagues, is financially. No question that marriage provides more financial security now than it did when I was born in 1970, for instance. And a bunch of different, things like, median income, poverty, affluence. These are all these outcomes are more closely tied to adult marital status than they were, about 5 decades ago. Okay. Now on the emotional and the social side, I'm still kind of looking at data, and we'll come back to that, hopefully in some future research. But then for kids, there's no question that when it comes to college graduation, when it comes to school suspensions, when it comes to young adult financial success, both me and other scholars are finding that there's a kind of cohort or generational pattern where the link between being raised in a stable married family, Liz, and child outcomes is stronger on, college graduation, school attainment in terms of how many years of schooling you've had, school suspensions, and how well you're doing financially, both for women and for men in their late 20s, early 30s. So that's, I think, striking. And I attribute that in part to the way in which maybe marriage matters more in, as I was saying, kind of a more anomic world that we're living in with, things, there's less community supports, et cetera. But I also think, too, another piece for kids is just that dads are more engaged today than they were when I was born in 1970, right? And so, and not to mention before then, right? So I think what's happening is that kids who have the benefit of stably married parents get a lot of mom time and a lot of dad time.
Yeah, the best of both worlds, right?
Right. So, again, I'm not saying that every family is perfect, that's stably married, but I'm saying that on average, kids benefit today, I think, more from a stable marriage because dads are more involved than they would have, in an earlier era. And just one caveat to all this, and that is just, I think that the big challenge, I think, from critics of this idea that I have is just they would say, well, marriage is more selective, right? And so the kinds of marriages that we're seeing today, Dave and Liz, are more likely to be, relatively educated, relatively more affluent, relatively more religious, and also now relatively more conservative. And those factors might help to also account for some of these kind of patterns that I'm seeing in the data. But I do think that just sort of marriage is more of a safe harbor now than it used to be for a lot of kids and adults.
And dads are so important.
Mm.
I mean, don't we see that in some areas that struggle, some sects of people in the U.S., let's just say, that struggle without a father? It seems like that's where I see some of the
right.
problems.
Yeah. And so I think, so in terms of the child outcomes that I looked at for this book, the most kind of, I think, striking finding that I came across, I'm just looking at my notes here, is that for young men today, they are more likely to end up in prison or in jail by about age 30 if they're raised in any kind of non-intact family, compared to, again, graduating from college. By contrast, young men who are being raised in an intact family are about 4 times more likely to graduate from college than they are to spend any time in prison or in jail. So it's just kind of, I look at, in my book, I look at things like, sadness. I look at anxiety. I look at a variety of different, for adults, look at suicide. But in terms of the kids' outcomes, was just most struck by the way in which for younger men, and effectively for boys, as they go across the life course, there's this path to prison or college graduation that diverges sharply for boys from intact families versus boys from non-intact families.
We'll be right back after this brief message. And we're back. Well, let's dive right in. Brad, you mentioned earlier a little bit about technology, and Brandon McDaniel, a good friend of mine, coined the term technoference. He talks about how technology can be a real struggle for couples today. Are there other big obstacles, challenges? I have a married daughter. Another one is going to get married this summer. And I just kind of look, what are they're going to have all kinds of challenges in addition to the kind of the normal typical ones. But yeah, what does it look like, I guess, the next 10, 20 years for couples and the challenges they'll experience?
So I think there is a way in which, for a lot of younger women, they're having difficulty finding young men who they think are worthy of dating and marrying. And then once they are married to them, they find oftentimes that the guys don't seem to kind of quite measure up in the way that maybe their dad or their grandfather would have on some, outcomes related to things like professional work or just being helpful around the home. So in some ways, like, we're more egalitarian today, but I think that the challenge is we haven't kind of given our teenage boys and young men like a clear script and a set of skills that would prepare them both for flourishing at work and then flourishing as a husband and father. And so that kind of thing can lead to frustration on the part of women who feel like they're juggling, caring for kids, managing the household, doing that emotional labor, managing the household and the kids. And then sometimes, carrying a bigger load, in terms of breadwinning than they had anticipated as well. So that's, I think, one big issue that's more salient today, I think, for younger couples. Another issue that I think can play out too is that, many women are expecting to do more professionally. And it just, it can create kind of a juggling challenge where how do you juggle, work and kids and the marriage, and also like resentment that your husband's not doing half of housework or half the childcare or half of the emotional work of managing the family. And so I think that's a challenge too that we see playing out for plenty of middle-aged younger couples as well. And then we also live in a more secular society, and I think people are too isolated, both from religious communities and from other forms of community as well. And I think they tend to be more likely to flourish when they have, decent friends who are with them and for them when they're, navigating a challenging teenager who's maybe having psychological problems, or, a colicky infant, or, a child with autism. You can kind of imagine all. So if you're just isolated, as a couple without help from friends or from kin, I think that can be extremely difficult as well today. So those are some of the challenges that I see. I guess I'd also add pornography too can be, an issue as well, and kind of helping couples, especially men, kind of, steer clear of pornography and addressing that issue in a constructive way if it comes up too. I think that's something that I hear about as well.
Yeah. Yeah. We've definitely seen that in the research of how destructive it can be. For couples and the commitment or the loyalty and the emotional and infidelity, all that kind of thing that can lead to. So thank you. Yeah.
You boldly speak, Brad, about the concerns of rising cohabitation as it pertains to marriage. Why should couples take more time to think through the implications of moving in without marriage?
So I think we in this culture, we don't always kind of appreciate, Liz, kind of the power and the value of ritual and ceremony, right? And so I think, too many people don't understand that, there are often moments in most cultures where you have like these giant thresholds, these coming of age ceremonies, for instance, in many religious traditions, but also many more traditional cultures. College graduation is one place here at UVA. It's sort of pomp and circumstance, right? And it's marking a big transition between being less educated and more educated, right? And the same thing applies, to love and family, right? So I think the beauty of a wedding ceremony is you have a big public ritual where you're bringing in family and friends to mark your deep and abiding lifelong commitment to one another. And so kind of jumping over that threshold in a meaningful and powerful way, I think, is partly about not living together before you jump over that threshold. And so that ritual becomes that much more meaningful when it marks the transition from singledom to marriage, I think, for people. So that's one point I would make. And I interviewed a couple from New York City, for instance, and they were distinctive. They met in New York, and she was in theater and he was in finance. Almost all their friends lived together before marriage, but they did not. And, she was talking about how when they moved into their married apartment and they moved to Texas once they got married, like it was just so special to have that first meal together, to do the first load of laundry together, to have the first Christmas tree put up together. For her was like really symbolic. And I think, she knew kind of implicitly that was not the same experience of a lot of her female friends. And then the guy said, he talked to a lot of his buddies from finance about, well, how is marriage different for you than before? And they're like, well, not much difference, because they had lived with their spouses prior to marriage. Whereas for him, it was a big difference, So I think kind of recognizing that just even at the sort of level of ritual and ceremony and kind of marking a transition of gain, that the wedding is important. Now, empirically, what we do know, Liz, is that folks who've cohabited with more than one person are more likely to end up divorced and unhappy in their marriages. And folks who kind of cohabit without any engagement, are also more likely to end up divorced as well. And so I think the point I would make is that kind of moving more slowly when it comes to dating, both physically and emotionally, tends to be better for most people. It gives you a chance to get to know someone well and make good decisions. And by contrast, folks who kind of move in quickly without kind of really testing the waters for a good friendship and common values and commitments are more likely to land in trouble. So my broader advice beyond just cohabitation is just to sort of, again, encourage couples when they're dating to move slowly when it comes to both emotional and physical intimacy. Make sure that they have a friendship, common values and commitments, common hobbies, not everything, but enough to sustain a friendship. And then if they have all that stuff, then it's time to start talking about marriage and a wedding. And you don't need to, I think, live together if you've kind of done the work of making sure you're good friends.
Mm-hmm. Making sure the foundation is laid. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Slow and intentional, really.
Right.
I love that. Brad, a lot of our listeners are young couples. They're eager, they're hopeful, but they're experiencing some struggles. Do you have even a few practical tips for listeners who are in the throes of this and the struggles?
So I think, Dave, one really important point to emphasize is that everyone has trouble, right? I think recognizing as a parent, as a spouse, as a friend, as a professional, right? All these different roles that we inhabit as adults. I think on social media, there are plenty of folks that kind of project perfection. And even in your neck of the woods, I mean, Ballerina, I was looking at Ballerina Farm, the other day and seeing the husband and father. I'm like, and I've got a lot of kids too, but my kids are not like, learning how to, run a farm, right?
Yeah.
I'm not in that league, right? So recognizing that, none of us are perfect. No marriage is perfect. No family is perfect. You're going to mess up, and you're going to be angry at your wife, your husband, all this kind of stuff. I think just sort of like trying to get people to realize and appreciate, especially in the social media age that we live in, that, failure and disappointment are staples of marriage and family life. So don't be worried if if things are going poorly or badly at one day or 1 month or 1 year, even in your marriage. Recognizing that's pretty common, I think, for most of us who are married. Trying to, I think, plug in with friends who are older and wiser than you. If you're looking for some counsel, is always a good, I think, move in that kind of situation. I'm Catholic. I think praying about your marriage, trying to figure out what you can do differently, to be a better spouse or better parent is always extremely helpful. I think one kind of recognized benefit, at least in the broader culture of prayer, is it really does give you an opportunity to be more reflexive or more reflective about what's happening, in your marriage or in your family. And often you can kind of discern a new path to travel that would make things better, by praying about it as well. So those are some of the things that I would kind of mention. But I think you just can't so you can't, I think we just need to stress to folks that, marriage, I'm a big proponent of marriage, but I want to be very clear here. It's sort of like how Churchill talked about democracy, right? Like, democracy is the worst form of government, known to man, unless you consider the alternatives, right? Sort of the idea. And being married is like the hardest thing, the worst thing about being in a relationship, whatever, unless you think about the alternatives, right? Like being single, for me would be really hard. And, being in some kind of permanent dating or cohabiting relationship would also would be hard as well. So marriage does present tons of challenges for any of us, but there is a safety and security there that comes with marriage that I think is wonderful, and kind of knowing that you can, have the most honest conversations with your best friend, and struggle together to get through tough times together.
Mm-hmm. There's nothing better than that, really. Or just someone, who knows you so well. And when they say, I still choose you, or I love you, it means a lot because you know me so well, right? There's nothing like that kind of love. Right. Yes. We call it unconditional love or knowing love, but it means a lot. My 33 years, Dave and Brad, being a marriage therapist, it's not uncommon to hear couples really talk about, should we stay together? We struggle so much. Should we stay together, however, for the kids? Should we wait till they're 18? Should we wait till they're out of the house? Brad, do you have any thoughts about that when that question has come up? What are your suggestions?
Yeah, so I think on the research side, I think if you're trying to prioritize the welfare of your kids, it's pretty clear that high conflict situations are situations where it's actually better for you to part ways. And Liz, you might have more of a granular sense of what that looks like. I'm just saying from the research-based perspective, I'm thinking of things like domestic violence on a regular basis, screaming fits, that kind of, or like sustained, drug or alcohol abuse, sustained patterns of infidelity, might sort of qualify for these kind of more high conflict scenarios. But in lower conflict situations where, say, one spouse is attracted to someone else, in their social network or in their office, or where one spouse is depressed, or where one spouse is, feeling like they're drifting apart, or just a kind of a reoccurring pattern of conflict, disappointment. I certainly see in my social network a lot of frustration with wives about husbands earning patterns, like that, their husband's not been like a reliable, provider over the years that they've been married. So, and I think the hard message I'm going to give to your audience, is that in those contexts, Liz, if your top priority is your kids, you stay with your spouse. And in fact, I know, for instance, there's a couple that I know, and a lot of frustration on the part of the wife with the husband's sort of fickle employment. But they had a lot of kids, and they got divorced recently, and their kids have been not all of them, but many of them completely at sea, a lot of problems. And my kids told me recently that they were hesitant to some extent about marriage because they had seen this couple that we know who have a lot of kids, married a long time, get divorced. I think you can't minimize like the way in which divorce really is a scandal in the classical use of that term. It does tend to diminish your own kids' faith in love and marriage, and even the faith of kids in your broader social network, So I think people should be more careful about heading for divorce and recognizing that there are resources. There are people like you, Liz, out there who can, work with them and help them navigate the challenges, and recognizing too that people often do, change at some margin, and something that was a big challenge at one point in your marriage can, be worked through across, a number of years oftentimes as well.
People change. I really believe that, or I wouldn't be in the business of people change, It's interesting that you say that. I appreciate that. We're always so aware of our own children, perhaps, right? The effects that can have on our circle. But we forget about the message that is the domino effect, right? Of our children's peers and our other family members, extended family members, friends, neighbors. It's powerful. It's a powerful message, staying or divorcing. What do you see in terms of marriage, Brad, 20, 30 years down the road? The same types of challenges, struggles, or different ones?
Well, I think one thing, Liz, that I've seen in the data is there's been a tremendous decline in the share of American adults who are married from 1970 to about the present, where a large majority of Americans, were married in the 50s and 60s, and now just more than 50% of adults are married. And then for kids, we obviously seen a tremendous increase in family instability and single parenthood for kids from the 60s until the recent present. But we have seen a kind of stabilizing pattern in recent years for kids. So now more kids are being raised in stably married homes today than was the case, say, about 10 years ago. And we just saw with Pew last week a slight uptick in the share of adults who are married. That's because divorce is down. So I think the good news here to give to you and your audience is that I think for Americans who are getting married and having families today, they're, I think, actually for all of their challenges, experiencing a bit more success, at least in terms of family stability. And that's an important, I think, outcome to pay attention to. But my concern is that I think marriage is increasingly the preserve of more educated, more affluent, more religious, and more conservative Americans. And so I think 10, 20 years from now, we're going to see more Americans who are working class, poor, secular, and liberal not being married. And I think that's a tragedy because I think marriage is a universal and human institution that benefits not everyone should be married, but benefits most people. And in fact, we're going to have, I think, this divide continuing to kind of play out along both class and cultural lines, makes me concerned for people who are going to be on the other side of that divide, if you will.
Mm-hmm. We'll be right back after this brief message. And we're back. Well, let's dive right in. Brad, you've talked about this in some of your books. You've written several books. You have a new one out this past year in 2024 called Get Married, Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Strong Families, and Save Civilization. First, can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book, and then share a couple of the maybe takeaways or major points that you make in the book?
So I've been doing a lot of work, Dave, over the years, kind of focusing on the way in which stable marriages benefit kids. I was raised by a single mom, and I think just had a kind of personal interest in the sort of value of stable families for children. But as I've talked to a lot of students at UV, especially women, I've just had the sense that they're finding dating more difficult, more challenging, and their concern is that they're not going to be able to marry in the future. And so this kind of led me to think about the benefits of marriage for adults. So this book, which is just, behind me right here, is really targeting adults more than it's sort of targeting, in a sense, parents, although there's a chapter on kids as well in the book. But it's just trying to kind of make the case that women and men, especially in their 20s, should be a lot more kind of diligent about focusing on dating with an eye towards marriage, should kind of give the institution of marriage more attention, more concern, more sort of cognitive, effort than often they're giving to their career and their education. And explaining how much marriage matters for adults today, and then also kind of giving them some tips about how to forge a strong and stable marriage. And I'm also kind of speaking against two different camps. On the left, we have a lot of kind of more feminist leaning, writers, journalists, professors who kind of say marriage and family are kind of a bad deal for women. And now on the right, we have people like Andrew Tate who are saying that marriage is a bad deal for guys. In fact, I was actually giving a talk about a year ago in Salt Lake City to a group of younger adults, kids at an LBS-related school in Salt Lake City. And a teenage boy in that community was asking me about Andrew Tate's critique of marriage. So, this is like all over the place, even, there in your neck of the woods, Dave and Liz. And so what I'm able to show in the book is that for the average woman and man, if they're married, they're more likely to be flourishing, emotionally, they're happier on average, and financially as well, compared to their female and male peers who are not married. And no group of Americans kind of in that broad middle-age swath of 35 to 55 are happier than married dads and married moms. And so I think a lot of people aren't aware of these kind of findings. And my book talks about kind of the value of marriage, family life for generating a sense of meaning and purpose for adults. And also most of the time, of course, not all the time, a sense of happiness. And then at the civilizational piece, just kind of mentioning that when it comes to, I live here kind of in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson. And he, of course, drafted that passage about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as sort of three core values in our own American civilization. What we see from the research, Dave, today is that when it comes to the pursuit of happiness, the number one reason why we're seeing a decline in happiness in America is the fact that fewer Americans are married. Based upon a recent Chicago study, the number one factor that one recent economist found in looking at deaths of despair on the life issue for America, for instance, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, is the fact that fewer Americans in regions where deaths of despair are more common are married. That was the number one factor in his regional analysis of deaths of despair. Of course, this is hitting working class men, especially hard, guys who are either never married or divorced or particularly vulnerable to deaths of despair now in the United States, deaths related to suicide, alcohol poisoning, and drug overdoses. And then on the liberty piece, economic liberty, we see work from Raj Chetty telling us that the number one factor for the American dream, realizing that rags to riches mobility for poor kids is the share of two-parent families in a community. And so what Raj Chetty at Harvard finds is that one of the top communities for mobility for poor kids, that is going from being poor as a child to being affluent as an adult, again, rags to riches, that classic Horatio Alger story in America, is the share of two-parent families in your community. More important than race, more important than economic inequality, more important than school spending, I think, in his models. And so Raj Chetty finds when he looks at metro areas across the U.S. that Salt Lake City metro area is one of the top places for mobility for poor kids, and that a place like Charlotte or Atlanta are some of the worst places for mobility for poor kids. And one of the big factors there is that there are more married, I would say, two-parent families in Utah than there are in southern, North Carolina and in northern Georgia. So the point that I'm making is that we don't appreciate how much I think what happens in our own homes matters, not just for our own kids and for our own adult well-being, but for our communities and, cities, towns, states, and for the country at large. So that sort of gives you a quick sense of some of the key things. One more thing I'll just mention quickly too, is that when the word of the book was kind of coming out, Matt Iglesias, who's a smart center-left journalist, but kind of a smart aleck too, was like, what does this defy the elites, subtitle in Brad's book? Because the elites are the ones who are more likely to get married and stay married today in America. And I was, like, well, Matt, you got to read the book when it comes out. But the point I'm making in the book is that our elites often talk left in public about family-related matters, but they walk right in their own private lives. And we've seen this like with recent promotion of polyamory. We've seen this with kind of the public embrace of family diversity for kids. We see this with elite thinking about kind of finances. They tend to kind of counsel people who have separate accounts. And yet the science tells us, that it's better for people to embrace monogamy, on a whole bunch of outcomes. We see that the science tells us that, kids do best in an intact married family. And the whole family diversity idea that all family forms are, equally valuable is empirically false. And we see too, when it comes to things like how you manage your finances, the couples who kind of have that more classic approach of commingling funds, sharing funds, do better than couples who kind of keep separate accounts. So what I'm saying is that when it comes to defining elites is that you should kind of defy a lot of the more elite ideas about how to organize marriage and family life and embrace a kind of what I call a family first approach to marriage, which is more successful.
Wow. What kind of breaks my heart is some friends or their listeners tuning in who didn't want to be divorced, right? They wanted to save their marriage. They are divorced. No fault of their own, or a little fault of their own, perhaps. And yet they still want to give their children that. Do you think, Brad, Dave, is there a second opportunity at a remarriage? Is a family first a possibility? Brad, do you see that in any of the research? Can we still do well when there is a divorce? Maybe we choose better and mate the second time around, or have some different patterns, different habits. Is there anything you've seen just by chance?
I think there's certainly folks who succeed at remarriage. Both Liz and Dave, I'm sure you know that. I've seen that in my own personal life, but I do think it's challenging, kind of from a social scientific perspective, because you are kind of navigating oftentimes two households, and that creates new challenges. And I think sometimes people too make the same mistakes they did with their old, spouse that they do with either in terms of the search process or, in the marriage itself. So it's certainly a challenge. And I would say, trying to be very clear about both the limitations of your spouse, your first spouse, and your own limitations in making a second marriage would be crucial. Being even more intentional about getting support from friends and community and making that second marriage.
It's probably even more crucial, isn't it? That second marriage, probably even more crucial.
Right.
Thank you.
I was raised by a single mom. My dad died when I was 3. My mom never remarried. So it's also have to be honest with your audience too, that on some outcomes, there's just no question that kids who are raised by stable single parents do better than kids who are raised in step families. Because, that's a whole different dynamic, and it can be challenging for kids and for step parents to kind of figure out how to, navigate that second relationship. So
that is not for the faint of heart, is it?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
That remarriage. But I am so happy for the success stories that are there. But I really appreciate the strong message of really think long and hard about that remarriage. Can you share with our listeners, Brad, where they can find out more about you, your work, your books?
So the book is available on Amazon and other kinds of Harper's outlet as well. And then I work with colleagues at the Institute for Family Studies, and that is familystudies.org. And then I'm also involved with the National Marriage Project at UVA, and that's also accessible through Google as well. So those are some places. And finally, I'm on X too, Brad Wilcox IFS on X. And I do tweet on a regular basis about family topics on my Twitter or my X account.
Oh, good for you. Thank you for all those contributions. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And we'll be sure to our listeners, we'll put all those links where you can see all those that Brad just mentioned. We'll put those in our show notes. So be sure to check those out. Hey, Brad, before we let you go, we like to ask a couple of questions. The first one is, in your professional experience, all that you've seen and done, what do you feel like is the key to a stronger marriage connection?
So I think, communication is so important. And I do think I mentioned date nights earlier, but I think kind of having opportunities to kind of get away from, we have a big family. So kind of just getting away as a couple and, grabbing dinner or doing something special that's sort of out of the ordinary. also helps kind of facilitate that kind of communication. But I think trying to constantly, especially for, as a husband, trying to work on doing, my wife will send me like dissertation level texts, and I'll say yes or no in response to her text. But I've got to like continue to work on, just being more communicative. That's one thing I would say. I guess one more thing I would just say too is kind of emotional regulation is so important. I think to recognize that you've just got to like bite your tongue and smile and say thank you. As a husband, father, wife, mother, son, daughter, more than you're inclined to do. And the more you kind of make that effort, even when it's hard and challenging, especially when it's hard and challenging, the better things will go for you. So,
yeah, love it. And my last question for you, Brad, is that we call it a takeaway of the day. Is there a take home message you want our listeners to remember from all that we've chatted about today?
I think the one extra thing that I would say is just trying to understand and appreciate kind of how you bring something unique to your marriage and family, and how your spouse brings something unique too. I think part of the challenge today is that in a more egalitarian age like ours, there can be kind of like competition or resentment around things not being exactly 50-50, in a marriage or family, and trying to just cultivate a sense of like, my wife does this, so much better than I do, or vice, my husband does that, so much better than I do. So just cultivating a sense of appreciation for the distinctive gifts and talents that your spouse brings, and expressing that gratitude for those gifts and talents on a regular basis, I think is helpful.
No, absolutely love that. Yeah, thank you. Liz, what about you? What's your takeaway of the day with Brad?
I so appreciate the bold and brave messages, Brad and Dave, of today, of just say no to cohabiting and just say yes to getting married and staying married. Dave, what's your takeaway?
Yeah. This has been a great discussion today, Brad. So much that you are able to share, just your knowledge on all of this topic. We come back to something. It's just a simple message earlier that you talked about, but you know what? All relationships are going to have struggles, and we talked a little bit about intentionality, right? Whether it is choosing what to focus on, what to look at, what to text, how to respond. It's more of a kind of a slowing down, learning to respond instead of react so quickly to things that are going on in the relationship, and to offer couples hope. There's hope and happiness. We talk a lot about some doom and gloom, maybe some challenges and struggles that a lot of couples feel, but I really feel like there is hope. Sticking to the basics, some of the basics that we've talked about, holding true to those virtues, or those foundational principles. I think that you've been taught, or maybe haven't been taught in the home, but you can be a transitional character. Brad, any parting words before we let you go?
I think the only thing that I would say is that I think Americans today, maybe not your audience, but Americans in general, tend to think that the most important path for them runs through career and work. And what I want to say to them is that that's actually false. And for most Americans, our friendships and our family relationships, especially our marriages, are the most important, sources of meaning and happiness. And so, take that in and act accordingly.
Well said, my friend. Well, hey, Brad, thanks so much for joining us today. Mm-hmm. And for our listeners, we'll see you next time on the Stronger Marriage Connection podcast.
I'm ordering that book right now, Brad. Okay. And do remember, it's the small things that create a stronger marriage connection. We'll see you soon.
Thanks for joining us today. Hey, do us a favor and take a second to subscribe to our podcast and the Utah Marriage Commission YouTube channel at Utah Marriage Commission, where you can watch this and every episode of the show. Be sure to smash the like button, leave a comment, and share this episode with a friend. You can also follow and interact with us on Instagram at Stronger Marriage Life and Facebook at Stronger Marriage. So be sure to share with us which topics you loved or which guests we should have on the show next. If you want even more resources to improve your marriage or relationship connection, visit strongermarriage.org, where you'll find free workshops, e-courses, in-depth webinars, relationship surveys, and more. Each episode of Stronger Marriage Connection is hosted and sponsored by the Utah Marriage Commission at Utah State University. And finally, a big thanks to our producer, Rex Polanis, and the team at Utah State University. And you, our audience, you make this show possible. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the Utah Marriage Commission.